Hello everybody, welcome to episode 23 of Black Cat Theology. This is Dr. Peter Dillard welcoming you back, and it's good to be back. I realize that it's been some time since I've uploaded any new content to my YouTube channel. There are various reasons for that, one of which is that I have been very busy working on a new book about the relationship between Martin Heidegger's philosophy in his Beiträge zur Philosophie, the contributions to philosophy, and contemporary theology. I've also had some personal difficulties that I've been dealing with. Unfortunately, my mother passed away last month. She had contracted colon cancer. She had a mass in her colon that needed to be removed surgically. It was successfully, but unfortunately she suffered a post-operative stroke that left her unable to take food and water, and because she did not wish to be resuscitated, she died not very long after that. It was within a few days. So I've been dealing with that personal issue. It's very difficult for me to see her suffer in that way, of course, because I loved her and she is the finest role model that I've ever had in my life. And mostly it was hard to watch it because I knew that she would not have wanted to be in that situation at all, where she was incapacitated and was not able to speak or to move very much. But now, thank God, she no longer is in that situation, and so that may be a blessing in disguise. I also wanted to give my viewers an update on my developments in my professional career, a few. As I mentioned, I'm working on this new book about Heidegger, and I hope to make a proposal to a publisher soon. I also was happy to hear that my article on John Duns Scotus's Doctrine of Predestination has been accepted by Irish Theological Quarterly. I'm awaiting the proofs for that article, and hopefully it will appear sometime later this year or early next year. I will keep you posted about that. But while I was in Tennessee, where my mother lived and where she passed away, and when I was dealing with the many different issues that I had to, including her diagnosis, her surgery, then the stroke, and having to move her into hospice care, her death and her funeral. And I'm, by the way, very thankful to my family and friends for supporting me throughout this very difficult time. It meant a lot to me and helped me get through it. Also, then I had to deal with the various complex legal issues and financial issues that have to do with setting up a deceased person's estate and putting it into probate. Of course, I am responsible for that estate since I am the executor. So I was very busy for the last month. I spent almost a month in Tennessee dealing with those various issues, that complex gamut of issues. But I did manage to get some work done, not just on the Heidegger book, but I also have been thinking about some existentialist philosophers, or we might say proto-existentialist philosophers, two of them, Søren Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. While I was in Tennessee, I was reading works by both of those thinkers and thinking about them carefully in a way that I haven't for some time. So it might have been that in this rather existential situation where I'm dealing with my mother's mortality and the thoughts of my own and other people's mortality that naturally brings with it, it's possible that predisposed me to be more attentive to some of these existentialist themes. So what I want to do in my video today is discuss a couple of issues that arise, one of them in Kierkegaard's work, The Sickness Unto Death, and his related work, Fear and Trembling, Furcht und Zittern, Fear and Trembling, and The Sickness Unto Death is Die Krankheit zu Tod. And I also want to talk a little bit about Nietzsche towards the end of this video. The issue in Kierkegaard that interests me is his understanding of faith. Now, in The Sickness Unto Death, the primary focus of that work is sin, which Kierkegaard understands as a kind of despair. But sin obviously is understood in contrast or in contradistinction to faith. And in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard clarifies what he has in mind by faith. Those of you who have read that text will know that he understands faith as involving a kind of leap. And his paradigmatic example of the knight of faith, the person of faith, is Abraham, where God, many years ago, God has given Abraham and Sarah, when they were of advanced age, a son, which is totally unexpected. And now God he puts Abraham to the test and commands him to sacrifice this child, Isaac, who's grown into a young man, a youth, to sacrifice him as a blood offering. So Abraham is being asked to sacrifice the very thing that God has given him, and Abraham doesn't question this. He just obeys God. He doesn't show any signs, any visible signs of anxiety or of consternation or anything like that. He obeys God's commandment in the hope, Kierkegaard says, and in faith, that God will somehow, against all reason and all conceivable possibility, will restore to Abraham Isaac once he's been killed, once he's been sacrificed. So for Kierkegaard, that is the paradigmatic example, the paradigm of faith. Now, certain questions arise about that, and in particular what I want to discuss here today, one thing I want to discuss is whether this understanding of faith is theologically viable. One reason that someone might give for thinking it's not is that sometimes it sounds like the way Kierkegaard understands faith is comparable to people who say that, well, maybe God is commanding them to commit an attack, to kill a bunch of people, to bomb a building, or to fly an airplane into a tower like we saw at 9/11 or something like that. And so these people might believe that God is commanding to do this and that they just automatically obey it without even hesitating. Why isn't that an example of faith, which is presumably something we would not want to accept as an acceptable form of faith? Now, I think that Kierkegaard can say some things about that. One thing that he stresses in Furcht und Zittern, in Fear and Trembling, is that with faith, and more generally with the religious life, there needs to be what Kierkegaard calls a teleological suspension of the ethical universal, and indeed of all universals. Now here Kierkegaard is taking a swipe at Hegel, because in Hegel's philosophy there is this emphasis upon the concept or the universal that develops through history and is basically the process of absolute spirit coming to full self-transparency. So Kierkegaard's beef with Hegel, one of them at least, is that this universalizing philosophy obscures what is essential to the religious life, namely the individual person and how one becomes an individual person of faith. Now, Kierkegaard might, when we're talking about like a jihadist case, or the distortion of the notion of jihad, or the terrorist case, Kierkegaard might say, well, look, somebody who thinks that he or she's being commanded to kill a bunch of people in order to be a successful terrorist, well, right there we already see a problem, because the person, if the person follows this or executes what she believes she's being commanded or he believes is being commanded to do, that person doesn't really become an individual. That person becomes an instance of a type or a generality, a terrorist or a jihadist in some distorted sense of that term. That's a type. That's a kind. That's not a real concrete flesh and blood spiritual individual, Kierkegaard might say. Furthermore, the whole example of somebody killing out of some politically motivated ground that the person thinks is also being underwritten by God, that doesn't really structurally conform to the kind of case that we see with Abraham, where Abraham has been given something by God, which he totally unexpected, namely Isaac. God is then commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but Abraham believes that he will get it back. In what Kierkegaard calls infinite resignation in Fear and Trembling, he will get back the very thing that God has given him earlier, that God is now commanding him to sacrifice. He will get it back. And so there's this kind of faith in almost like a resurrection, or in God's promises, or restoration, let's say, of the thing that's being given up. That doesn't really have anything to do with the case of a politically or theocratically motivated kind of terrorism. But I do want to say that I think with Kierkegaard, there are reasons to be concerned about the way he understands faith, at least in Fear and Trembling. One of the things that Kierkegaard wants to work against, is a very central category in his thinking. His thinking is very psychological. When Kierkegaard is thinking about religion or faith, he wants to insulate faith against doubt. So he wants to try to avoid thinking about faith or other religious notions in any way that might instill corrosive doubt. That's the enemy of faith. Now, the question, it seems to me, before us is whether this notion of faith as a kind of leaping, comparable to what happens in Abraham, with Abraham and Isaac, does that in some way, or might that in some way instill doubt? And it seems to me that it could. Let's not think so much about Abraham now, who is the knight of faith. But let's think about somebody, an ordinary person of faith, who's trying to do the best that he or she can in following God's commandments and worshiping Christ and having faith that one day Christ will return. Well, that person isn't like Abraham, really. That person has not been, as they would say in German, auf die Probe gestellt, has not been put to the test in the way that Abraham has. So I could see a person of faith, an ordinary person of faith like you or me, saying, well, I've never really been put to the test in the way that Abraham was. Some of us have, but many of us have not. So I don't know, I might say to myself, or you might say to yourself, I don't really know whether I would pass that test. I might, at the last minute, I might jerk back, or I might say, no, I can't do this. I cannot follow through with what God is telling me to do. How do I know? And, worse, even if somebody has been auf die Probe gestellt, put to the test in this way, how do you know that you will continue to succeed if you're put to the test again? Maybe Abraham next time won't be so chary about following God's commandment to do something that seems completely outrageous in the hope that he's going to somehow get it back. Who knows? Maybe Abraham will start to be more like Job in the Old Testament than the kind of knight of faith that Kierkegaard talks about. So my concern about this is theological, and it is that the way that when Kierkegaard starts talking about faith, it's almost like a super achievement, or something that a superman might do, or a superwoman, or whatever. That's a very high hurdle, and most of us have not had that kind of experience, and we might reasonably doubt whether we would be able to follow it through or to carry it through. And even if we have been tested in that way, we might reasonably doubt that, well, next time we won't be so lucky. Next time we might hesitate. We might not follow through. We might fail. So that's the kind of corrosive doubt that needs to be avoided, this kind of psychological category of doubting that's very central to Kierkegaard's approach to theology. Now, there may be other ways that Kierkegaard has of thinking about faith that avoid this problem. There may be, for example, in the second part, the second half of the second part of Entweder oder, either or, Kierkegaard presents a different kind of understanding of faith, it seems to me, where there's supposed to be a kind of upbuilding. And the idea is that, well, somebody believes that he or she is always wrong before God. Now, what exactly does that mean? I don't know. It's something that I need to think more about. It's something that I would commend those of you who are interested in this question to think more about. But it is the way that Kierkegaard thinks about it is that, well, look, my relationship to God should be towards somebody that I deeply love. And if something doesn't seem right, then just as I would with a loved one, I would say, well, maybe the fault is with me, not with God. And I would try to get to the bottom of that. And I would keep trying so that there's a kind of upbuilding. Now, I don't know whether that resolves the kind or avoids the kind of problem that I just mentioned with Kierkegaard's notion of faith as leaping in fear and trembling. But it's something that needs to be investigated because Kierkegaard needs, it seems to me, a theologically and philosophically viable answer to, well, how can you understand faith in a way that avoids this kind of corrosive doubt? Now, that's what I wanted to talk about in connection with Kierkegaard. What about Nietzsche in the Götzendämmerung, the twilight of the gods, the twilight of the idols, I should say, which he thinks gods certainly are idols because Nietzsche is avowedly, at this point in his career, anti-religious, anti-Christian. He despises that. Now, I think here what I want to say briefly is that when we approach Nietzsche, we need to be very honest about the fact that Nietzsche is quite hostile to Christianity and religious ideas. He thinks that they are not life-affirming, but life-destroying, that they are excuses or constructs that people use, that the weaker people who at least are initially weaker, use to oppress people who are naturally stronger. And so he's very, very suspicious of that. Now, whether he's right or wrong about that, is not something we need to get. I think he's wrong, but we don't need to get into that right now. The question, it seems to me, for us today is, given that Nietzsche has this kind of anti-religious and anti-theological animus, what could a theologian possibly take of value from Götzendämmerung, Beyond Good and Evil, and other works by Nietzsche where he expresses this kind of anti-religious and anti-theological animus? Now here I want to say the following. We need to distinguish between faith and theology. And one way that we might try to incorporate some of the things that Nietzsche says as theologians is to say, well, look, maybe Nietzsche understands his critique as directed against religion simplicity, or all of it. But we might say, maybe what's going on here is that Nietzsche is really criticizing problematic ways of thinking about religion, not religions itself, so that his critique, the idols in question, may not be, when we look at this in a more reflective way, and in a less, in a more, hopefully more objective and a fairer way, it's not so much that the critique means that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, that we get rid of faith per se. It's that though there are harmful ways of understanding faith, theological, problematic theological conceptions, that Nietzsche's critique can be understood as directed against. Let me give you an example. Over and over again in Götzendämmerung, Nietzsche complains about Christianity as anti-body, anti-life. There's this hostility in Christianity, Nietzsche argues, against the body, against the natural person, against life. And I think we can sometimes see that in certain versions of Christianity, sometimes even in some of the things that St. Paul says about the dialectic between the spirit and the flesh. That can be understood in a way that is very hostile to the flesh, that is very hostile to the body. But let's step back from that a minute. Does that have anything to do with Christianity in its kernel, per se? Obviously, it can't, because the central teaching of Christianity is that God became a human being, not some ghost or some spiritual being, but a flesh and blood human being, Jesus of Nazareth, who walked the earth and lived, died, ate, had emotions, probably was attracted to people, just like every other human being, a person with a body, a fully embodied person. And so the notion of the flesh is very important to Christianity. In fact, Christianity elevates that by saying, well, God has become flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. So what this points out to us, it seems to me, is that we are in a better position, and we're making more sense in our thinking if we take Nietzsche's critique about this duality between spirit, this unhealthy duality between spirit and flesh, not to pertain per se to Christian faith, but it should pertain to false theologies of that faith. Theologies that glorify spirit and demean flesh, and so distort what is basically the central Christian teaching of the Incarnation. So the critique is better understood, I am arguing, as directed against this problematic kind of theology and possibly other ones. We would have to comb through Nietzsche's work to see what those might be. The critique is better understood as directed against these false theological conceptions as opposed to the faith itself. That's a way of taking Nietzsche. He may not like it, but he hasn't ruled it out, and as theologians we should seriously consider whether we might learn some things about theologically problematic conceptions from Nietzsche by studying his works very, very carefully, even if we do not agree with him about the Christian faith per se. So that's what I wanted to say today. Now, next time I would like to say some more about Kierkegaard, and I would also like to say some more about Nietzsche in connection with a pair of other issues. But that's enough for now. Thank you for your attention. Please feel free to leave any questions, and I will try to respond to them if I have time. Also, thank all of you who have been watching my videos. I really do appreciate your Aufmerksamkeit, your attention here. And thank you for your patience. I know that it has been some time since I posted, but I am going to try to post more content in the near future. So thank you again, and have a good day.